get started. So, yeah, so Kutan, you missed last week and I forgot to put up the recordings, and that's my bad. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to work through the handout I gave out last time. And the handout has a couple of quotations on it. It basically works through the first, what I take to be the first three sections of the Tractatus. So let me include that in the. I'm going to put it in the chat, the handout, and I'll also send the. Oh, sorry. Yes, sending things. Okay, here it is. Yeah, I'm going to send actually all of the handouts that I sent. Yeah. Okay. So that way you've got a bunch of handouts. So we're going to be talking about the handout on Wittgenstein today. Last class, I talked about the sort of background last week about the sort of disagreement with Russell. So there's the handout on Russell. I talked about the two quotes at the end of the handout on Wittgenstein, which I think give us an idea of where he's getting this idea of the picture theory of meaning from. And on my take, that it's often called the picture theory of meaning. I think we can kind of also think of it as something like the model theory of meaning. So what we get in language provides a sort of model of the world. Yeah. And so if we understand how models work and how modeling works, this is going to give us an understanding of how language works. We use language to model reality. And in order for the language to do this well, that the ways in which things can be moved in the model has to kind of correspond to the way things can be moved in the world. The way in which things can be put together and come apart in the model has to come together with the way things can come apart and be put together in the world. That's one thing I talked about last week. I also talked about these two competing interpretations. I talked a bit about Russell and his project of logical atomism and his discussion of knowledge by acquaintance and knowledge by description, and how this distinction plays a role in his theory of meaning, because Russell's committed to the idea that to understand a proposition, to understand the meaning of a proposition, we have to be acquainted with, we have to kind of know, grasp the meaning of all of the elements of the proposition. Yeah, so understanding a proposition involves acquaintance with the elements. And I talked about how Wittgenstein's idea comes from this. Russell at this time was a sort of phenomenalist, a sense data theorist, who thought that the only things we're acquainted with are our sense data, ourselves, and universals. Yeah, and maybe logical form. And I take it when we're talking about, when Wittgenstein at the beginning of the Tractatus talks about objects, I take it that these objects that occur in the world are, I take it to be individuals, properties, and relations. Yeah, so my reading of his account of what he means by objects, he has the idea of individuals, properties, and relations. And I take it that he doesn't want to commit himself to a form of phenomenalism. But it seems to me, I think Wittgenstein at this time basically probably was, or thought that some version of phenomenalism was probably correct. So that the individuals that make up our world, we might think of as kind of colored patches in our visual field, maybe something like that. Yeah, so that the objects that make up our world are going to be sense data or points in the visual field. Maybe the individuals are points. That the properties are going to be things like colors, and then the relations are going to be spatial relations. Yeah, in a sort of two-dimensional array, something like that. But Wittgenstein is very oblique about this. So I talked about how there were these two different readings of Wittgenstein. There's the kind of what I take to be the more traditional reading that is defended today most prominently by PMS hacker. Is it PMS, or is that something that happens when you have your period? I don't know. PMS, is it really PMS hacker? Or am I just kind of, is it PSM? I don't know. Yeah, but hacker, he's one of the leading Wittgenstein scholars, and he's I think the biggest defender of the traditional reading. That I compared the traditional reading to this new reading, and the most prominent defender of this is going to be Cora Diamond. They have this what's known as the resolute reading, and it's got to do with the degree to which we take seriously the claim that Wittgenstein makes in the preface and at the end of the Tractatus that everything he says in the Tractatus is nonsense. Yeah, so how the Tractatus seems to kind of tell the following story, that Wittgenstein offers a particular theory of meaning using language, and then according to this theory of meaning, the language he's used to describe the theory of meaning is nonsense. Yeah, so in some sense, that everything he says in the Tractatus, given his own theory of meaning, I think this is the traditional reading, is meaningless. Yeah, and in particular, that I said last time that the first rule of Tractatus Club is, don't say anything about logical form. Yeah, and so it turns out that he thinks that this account of the theory of meaning presupposes a story about logical form, that language and the world has to share the same logical form, but we can't say anything meaningful about logical form. But the whole story of the Tractatus involves telling a story about logical form. Yeah. Now, there was this famous Italian Marxist economist who was at Cambridge when Wittgenstein went back, and Wittgenstein was famous for whistling symphonies around Cambridge. He was a very good whistler, and did I completely disappeared. Are you guys? Did you guys disappear as well? Did the whole thing crash, or was it just me who disappeared?
Just you.
Okay, I'm having a problem. I'm using my phone's internet for this connection, and am I breaking up?
Now you are fine.
Okay, so I've moved into the living room. Okay, so hopefully the connection in here is a bit better, but okay, yeah. So that's so I've moved into the living room, and there's a bit too much light in here. But yeah, if you can see me, it's cool. Yeah, so that Hacker's got this famous response or well-known response to the Resolute reading in a paper called "Was He Trying to Whistle It?" And his answer is yes, that Wittgenstein is trying to kind of, in some sense, use language to communicate something about that which cannot be described. Yeah, and this is, I take it that this is what Wittgenstein in this towards the end of the Tractatus calls the mystical. Yeah. So my reading of Wittgenstein is the reading of Wittgenstein I'm going to give you is going to be closer to the kind of traditional Hacker type of reading of the Tractatus than this new kind of hardcore Resolute reading. Like the Resolute reading is sounds really macho and hard, you know, that everyone else is weak. Yeah, everyone else is floppy. Yeah, we're going to give you the kind of strong, hard, you know, hardcore Wittgenstein. But yeah, so my reading is more in line with the traditional reading, and I think, and this is now me speaking, not Hacker, but I think this sort of reading is closer to the sort of Hacker reading. Is I take it that one way of thinking about what Wittgenstein's doing in the Tractatus is it's a bit that he's committed to some sort of idealism. Yeah, so that when Wittgenstein talks about the world at the beginning of the Tractatus, what he's doing is he's offering an account of what the world must be like insofar as it can be described by language. Yeah. And I take it you might think this is a little bit like, this is the kind of linguistically describable world. I think this is a kind of a linguistic turned version of something like Kant's understanding of the phenomenal world. We have the world as it can be experienced, and then we have the concept of the world as it is in itself. And so Kant kind of introduces this distinction between the kind of the phenomenal world and things as they are in themselves. And the phenomenal world is the world insofar as it can be experienced. And the world, insofar as it can be experienced, depends upon our form of intuition, yeah, which is space and time. Yeah, so Kant sometimes calls his transcendental idealism formal idealism. This is how he describes it in the Antinomies. He says his idealism is about the form of the world. And I take it that insofar as the world can be described, it's got to share a certain form with our language, because language on this picture models the world, and in order for one thing to model another, that the thing that is modeled has to share a form with the model. Yeah, so you can only model something if the thing you're modeling shares the form of the model. Yeah, now language has a certain form. And so insofar as the world can be described by language, yeah, what form does language have? Well, in the later Wittgenstein, he talks about grammatical form. Here he talks about logical form, but we might think that in some sense, the world as it's insofar as it can be described, has to conform to something like the grammar or the logic of our language. So I take it that the Wittgenstein's idealism is a sort of form of linguistic idealism. That the limit of our world is the limit of our language. Yeah, and so the structure of our language imposes limits about what we can talk about, what we can describe. Yeah. It turns out, though, that everything important, Wittgenstein thinks, is such that it can't be described by language. Yeah. So in particular, God and values. yeah, religion and values are beyond the possibility of linguistic description. That the way in which language captures the world is also something that's beyond the capacity of language to capture, Wittgenstein thinks. Yeah. And so I take it that what we get in the Tractatus is we get this, he starts off by talking about the world, and he says the world is all that is the case. But this is not the intelligible world. This is not the world as it is in itself. This is the world insofar as we can talk about it. Now, I take it that in the preface, it looks like maybe there are things we can think about that we can't describe. So maybe the capacity of thought goes beyond the limit of language. Yeah, and we can use language to show us things that can't be said. Yeah, and so when language shows us something that can't be said, we kind of grasp something about the world as it is in itself, rather than the sort of the Wittgensteinian equivalent of the phenomenal world. Yeah, so my reading of the first section of the Tractatus, the 1s and 2s, is he starts off by describing the world. Yeah, but the task of this description of the world is such as to, this is what the world must be like insofar as we can describe it. Yep. And I think Wittgenstein does think that we can use language to describe things. This is what we do in science. So scientific language is a tool for describing, picturing reality. And it's a sort of very big tool. Now, Wittgenstein was read by the logical positivists, and especially A.J. Ayer, as basically kind of being a kind of pro-scientism. That what Wittgenstein was is he wanted to have a demarcation between what's meaningful and what's meaningless. And then everything that is meaningless is in some sense bollocks. That's a sort of technical term sorry, I'm just making sure I was recording. That's a sort of technical term in philosophy. It's not just meaningless, it's bullshit. Yeah. And I think that's not Wittgenstein's position. Yeah. In fact, kind of, I think his position is he's attracted to a certain form of mysticism where there are certain experiences that are not describable. And these are the things that are important in life. So Wittgenstein wrote the Tractatus when he was in the trenches. He was, being bombed, facing death every day. He thought a lot about death and God. I think after this period, he sort of converted to Catholicism and was quite serious about it. So as opposed to the logical positivists, I think Wittgenstein himself, especially at this period, was very taken by mysticism. He was a very judgmental, moralistic guy. Yeah. So of course, values, he thinks, can't be described. They're not part of the world. They're not all that is the case. Values tell us what there should be. Yeah, they don't value judgments don't tell us about the way things are. So values are not found in the world insofar as the world contains everything that can be described or pictured. But I think Wittgenstein took values very heavily. He was a kind of, in some sense, a real pain in the ass, a really judgmental, moralistic guy who, really disapproved of Russell because of Russell just had this crazy sex life. Wittgenstein himself was a bit of a naughty boy. He, especially when he was in Vienna, I think the evidence all suggests that he was kind of quite gay and spent a lot of the time in the parks picking up young men, which I think was something that he was very ashamed of. one of the things about Wittgenstein's personal life, I think, is that he never really came to terms with his own sexuality. And maybe that's why he's a bit anal. I don't really know. So this is my sort of little bit of background. So the beginning of the Tractatus is offering account of the nature of the world as it must be insofar as it can be described. So a state of affairs is a combination of objects, and I take it the objects are going to be things like individuals, properties, and relations. And so a state of affairs involves a combination of individuals, properties, and relations. Yeah, so Bashak can be above Ercan. Ercan can be happy. Ercan can be next to Dilde, is next to Dilde. These are all ways in which objects are combined to form a state of affairs. And of course, objects, there are limits on the way in which objects can be combined. So next to A's being next to B can't be next to C. Yeah, if you've got a relation, the things that have to be related are going to be individuals. If you've got an individual, to form a state of affairs, it's got to be combined with a property, or it has to stand in relation to another individual. Yeah, properties cannot be combined with each other. Being happy and being red is red and is happy. These are two properties. You can have an individual that is both red and happy. Yeah, but a property can only be combined with an individual. Yeah, and the sort of way the picture of meaning is going to work is that the way in which objects can be combined, if this corresponds to the way in which linguistic entities can be combined, if there's a sort of correspondence in the form, and I take it form we may think of here in terms of possibility of combination, if the way in which objects can be combined corresponds to the way in which names of the objects can be combined, then language is going to be able to function as a sort of model of reality. So I've got the word Bashak, I've got the word happy. Bashak is a noun, is happy is a predicate. And so Bashak, the word Bashak can be combined with is happy. Yep. And that Bashak is an object in the world and happiness as an object in the world. Happiness is not an individual, but it's a property. That the idea is that that every bit of language names something in the world, be it an object, a property, or a relation. And then the rules of grammar tell us the ways in which these names can be combined to form grammatically correct sentences. Yeah, and that an ideal language is going to be such that the rules that govern the way in which words can be combined reflect the way in which the objects corresponding to these words can be combined. Yep. And what glues together the words is the fact that they refer to things in the world that have a certain form that can only be combined in certain ways. Yeah, so one of the things going on in the background here is arguments with Russell about the unity of the proposition. In a proposition, you have, a subject and a predicate, and you put them together and you form a judgment or a sentence or a proposition. The word in Bashak, I'll just finish this and then So the word in German is Satz, which is sometimes translated as sentence, sometimes as proposition. It's sort of, in German, it's sort of ambiguous. But you put these things together, and if you put them together correctly, you have a unified judgment. But what is it that unifies the judgment? And I take it the sort of thought is that what makes the judgment have a certain sort of unity is that the things, the names that the things that the things that the words refer to in the world are such that when you put them together, they form a unity. Başak?
Like I understood what he tries to say, but like how can we know if we impose our structure of language to the world and like it doesn't mean
Yeah,
there's a correspondence. Maybe we just frame by language and we cannot just go out of that frame, and that's why there seems to be a correspondence.
yeah. So the thought, so I mean, how can we know any of this, given the fact that Wittgenstein is describing it to us, using language that he thinks ultimately is meaningless? Yeah. So I take it that in some sense, yeah, like it's something that isn't going to be justified through argument, because the truth of what he's saying, if there is some truth to what he's saying, isn't a truth that can be expressed in language. Yeah. So justifying this to us isn't going to involve providing us with arguments that in some sense are going to justify these claims that he makes, because the claims that he's making are, on his own admission, meaningless. Yeah. Instead, that these sort of the sort of language he's using, I think, shows us something. So I think that the sort of the sort of justification, the only sort of justification, how do we know this? I think it's got to be in terms of some sort of revelation, that we read the Tractatus and we kind of, the sort of idea is that if you read the Tractatus properly, you come to see that Wittgenstein is right. Yeah. And it's a matter of being shown something, of something being revealed, yeah, rather than a matter of something being sort of argued for and justified. Yeah. So I think, given his claims, that how can we know what he's saying is true? that it's through as we're reading it, we come to just see that something like this must be the case. I take it that one sort of thought you might have is that, and this is in some sense reading back some of the ideas of the investigations into the Tractatus, is that how do we what's involved in knowing the form of a particular language? Yeah, so it's going to turn out that the idea is that the form of the world has to conform to the form of our language. Yeah, so that the only things that we can describe are things that are going to conform to the form of our language. Yeah, so conform, you might think, yeah, we've got form in there. And you might think, well, how do you know the form of one's language? Yeah, what is the form? Here he talks about logical form. In the investigations, he talks about grammatical form. Well, what is it to know the grammar of a particular bit of language? So you might
To know the connotations, the links between other words and other things.
Yeah, so this is something that the Wittgenstein of the Tractatus might say. I take it that, like, the later Wittgenstein is committed to the idea that meaning is use. And so you might think that kind of knowing what is it to learn the grammar of a certain language. It's not knowing some abstract set of rules. It's basically knowing how to use words correctly. Yeah, so that we have a sort of mastery of the grammar of our language. Some of us do, some of us don't. Yeah. Through our sort of mastery of the language, which is a matter of sort of use. Yeah, so I take it that this sort of knowledge of grammar is something that, yeah, in the Wittgenstein of the Tractatus thinks that the sort of the basic logical form is something that we basically have a sort of implicit understanding of, but we can't really say what it consists in. So we know the difference between a subject and a predicate. Yep. We know that certain things can function as predicates, certain things can't. Yep. We understand that if you put two predicates together without a subject, you don't have a grammatically correct sentence. Yeah. So we have some sort of feeling for what counts as grammatical and what counts as ungrammatical. But then if someone asks you, well, what is a subject as opposed to a predicate? Yep. All we can say is what we're allowed to do with them. What it is, what this distinction between subject and predicate is in itself, Wittgenstein thinks, is something that can be shown, something that we in some sense, this is the kind of non-resolute reading, something that we can in some sense understand, but we can't use language to really precisely define it, because this distinction is a precondition of all language. Yeah, and as a sort of as a precondition, Wittgenstein for some reason thinks that it can't be expressed within the language. Now it's not obvious why you're going to think that why should a precondition of the possibility of language be something that is not describable within the language. Yeah, because you might think something can function as a precondition, but then once you've used it to kind of as a necessary condition for having a language, one can then describe it. I think the sort of idea is that if you've got a spatial model, that the model and the thing modeled both have to be in space. Yeah, and so the shared spatiality is something that isn't, the model doesn't describe this, but the model kind of presupposes it in order for the model to work. Yeah, so you can't use a spatial picture to say what space is. Although maybe once you've got the language of logic, you can use a sort of logical language to describe spatial form. But this logical language that you can use to describe spatial form, you could think of space as a kind of a representation of a line in terms of a set of axioms for a dense linear ordering without endpoints. So the sort of standard view is that you can use a set of axioms in logic to implicitly define a line. Yeah. And so you have a set of axioms that play this role. So you can use logical form, you can use language to describe spatial form, but the sort of idea is you can't use spatial form to describe the form of space. And you can't use a language can't describe its own form. This is like Wittgenstein's. Yeah, so this is number one. So I talked about this before, that we've got these objects, we've got states of affairs, combinations of objects. Objects, I take it, are going to be things like individuals, properties, and relations. Yeah, so he's a sort of realist in this medieval sense about believing in the existence of universals, I take it. So if I know an object, I know all its possible occurrences in states of affairs. Every one of these possibilities must be part of the nature of the object. So he thinks that any individual can, in principle, be combined with any property. Any two individuals can be combined, in principle, using a two-place relation. Any three individuals can be combined in a kind of three-way relation. Yeah, all of these combinations are possible, and they're written into the nature. What it is to be an individual is to be something that can have properties, is to be something that can stand in relations to other individuals. What it is to be a property is to be the possible property of an object. So there being objects in which the property can be a property of is part of the nature of the property. Yep, relations. So a two-place relation, yep, is an object that has kind of two holes in it, yeah, that need to be filled by individuals. Yeah, so individuals are like incomplete objects that need to be completed by having a property or standing in relations to other individuals. Properties are sort of incomplete objects because they need to be the property of an individual, and relations are incomplete objects because they have to stand in relations to other objects. They have to be individuals that stand in these relations. Yeah. So only a set of objects combined together in the right way produces what you might think of as a sort of complete object. And a complete object is a state of affairs. And a state of affairs is a possible way the world may be. Yeah. So amongst state of affairs, we've got all of the states of affairs. That gives us an account of everything that's possible. And then amongst the states of affairs, there's going to be some actual states of affairs. And actual states of affairs are facts. So we've got states of affairs, and then we've got a subclass of states of affairs, which are actual states of affairs. Yeah, so the world is the set of all the facts, all the actual states of affairs. But then we've got in some sense everything that's possible. So the way the world is, objects are combined in a particular way, but there are all these other ways objects could be combined, which is written into the nature of the objects. And that gives us the sum total of all possible ways the world could be. Yeah. And then an ideal language is going to be able to describe all the possible ways the world could be and nothing more. So an ideal language is only everything it's able to describe has to be possible, and everything possible has to be describable by it. Yeah. And so if the language can't describe something, then that is not a possible state of affairs. Yeah, this is the sort of picture. And this is why the limits of our language are the limits of our world. Yeah. So so objects are what are unalterable and subsistent. So the objects, in some sense, don't change. What changes? Possibility. Actuality is a matter of the way in which the possibilia are configured. Yeah, so you've got these objects, and that what changes is the configuration of objects. So just as the world is a particular configuration of objects, in language, we've got elements in the language, and the sort of idea is that if the elements in the language, if the rules that govern the way in which the elements of the language can be combined mirrored the rules that govern the way in which actual objects can be combined, then the language is going to be able to completely describe all possible reality. So that's discussion of the world and objects and states of affairs and facts. We then get it onto this idea of picturing. And I take it that the description of the world is such that it's only if the world is as so described that we're going to be able to picture it linguistically. So he then has a discussion of picture. So he says, so we picture facts to ourselves. A picture is a model of reality. So last class I talked about these two models that were very influential on Wittgenstein. There's the way in which a court case were describing an accident, and they had a sort of model of the accident with puppets. that was used for the various people to give their versions of events. We've also got the notion of a dynamic model introduced by Mack in his textbook on what was it called? Yeah, so sorry, Hertz on his principles of mechanics, where he talks about how a dynamic model works. And remember that Wittgenstein was kind of, before he shifted to philosophy, he was working as an aeronautical engineer. And so he was dealing with aeronautical models. Yeah, so you use, yes, I think modeling was something that he was quite familiar with, and this is what's lying behind. So he says, in a picture, objects have the elements of the picture corresponding to them. So if you've got an object you want to picture, if you've got a state of affairs you want to picture, then there have to be elements in the picture corresponding to elements in the state of affairs. Yeah, so you have bits of the picture, bits of the model correspond to objects in the state of affairs. So he says, in a picture, the elements of the picture are representatives of objects. Now, so you have bits of the picture that represent bits of reality. Bits of the model represent or refer to bits of the thing being modeled. But what constitutes a picture is that the elements are related to one another in a determinate way. So to model something, you need bits of the model to stand for bits of the world. And he says, what a picture must have in common with reality in order to be able to depict it correctly or incorrectly in the way it does is its pictorial form. Yeah, so he's introduced the logical form of the world in the first section, where he's sort of discussing the world. He now introduces the idea of pictorial form. Yeah, and he says, in order for a model to be able to model something, in order for a picture to be able to be a picture of something or a model of something, that the thing pictured must share a form. Yeah, so he says, a picture can depict any reality whose form it has. A spatial picture can depict anything spatial, a colored one, anything colored, etc. Yep. So in order for a picture to picture something, that the picture and the thing pictured have to share a particular form. But a picture cannot picture its form. So this is the kind of what leads to this sort of paradox that everything he says turns out to be meaningless. Yeah, so a picture cannot, however, depict its pictorial form. It displays it. Yeah. So you know, a painting on canvas that's depicting the world is something that exists in space, but it doesn't represent its own space, but it sort of displays its own spatial form. Yeah, in order to understand a spatial picture, in some sense, it presupposes that you grasp its spatial form. Yeah, but this is not something that the picture pictures. I don't know if anyone's interested in aesthetics. My dad is a painter, and I think in the 60s and 70s there was this kind of the end of art movement, and in painting you had the idea that the kind of end point of painting is for a picture to sort of depict itself. Yeah, so one sort of thought is you might think, well, can't you have a painting that sort of depicts itself, depicts its own form? Think of the blank canvas. Yeah, so you have a series of paintings and you could think of the history of art as doing this, where you kind of get rid of more and more representational content, and then suddenly you're left with the sort of blank canvas. And then you might think, well, I mean, what does this represent? Yeah, and you might think, well, it represents itself. Yeah, so does that represent, is it possible to use a painting to represent itself? I don't know. But this is Wittgenstein's sort of take, is that a picture cannot depict its own form, even though it displays its own form. In order to understand the picture, you've got to, in some sense, it presupposes a grasp of the form. But it's a form. It's like, it's like the form of Kant's form of intuition. The form of intuition makes experience possible. But in some sense, space itself can't, as a whole, can't be a possible object of intuition. Yep. Space, infinite given magnitude, the representation of space for Kant makes experience of the world possible. But the space itself can't be an object of experience. All we can experience are objects in space. And experience an object in space always presupposes that there's some space that we can't experience. Yep. So I think, once again, maybe there's a sort of Kantian idea laying in the background here. Yeah. So when we're talking about pictorial form, I think we might want to think about Kant's discussion of space as the form of intuition. That in order to understand a picture, I take it that we have to somehow grasp the spatial form of the picture. Yeah, but the picture itself doesn't depict this form. It's sort of, we can see it, it displays it, but it's not part of the representational content. What a realistic picture does is to depict objects in space, but it doesn't, you might think, but it doesn't depict space itself. Yeah, this is the idea. Now, he says that what a picture represents is its sense. It's not obvious how he's using sense. Is he before writing the Tractatus, he had met with Frege, been hanging out with Russell. I take it what a sense. So the representational, what is the representational content of a picture? What a kind of a realist picture, a sort of representationalist picture represents is a possible way things could be. Yeah. So what a picture represents is going to be something like a state of affairs. Yeah. And then we have a notion of truth. Is truth involves the agreement or disagreement of its sense with reality. Yeah. So so among state of affairs, some of them are facts. A picture can represent a whole bunch of state of affairs, a particular state of affairs, and then whether or not a picture is true depends upon whether or not what it represents is a fact or a merely kind of possible configuration of objects. Yeah. So he now introduces this notion of truth. I take it we might think of it as something like a version of correspondence theory of truth. And it's going to be important that he's got a working notion of truth, because in the second part of the Tractatus, once he's introduced his theory of meaning, he's then going to offer an account of how logic works. Yeah. And his account of how logic works presupposes that we have some account of truth, because he's going to basically define the logical operators in terms of truth tables. Yeah. And so he's preparing the ground in these first sections. He's offering a theory of meaning. According to this theory of meaning, that the theory of meaning being offered is itself meaningless, which is kind of quite paradoxical. But he's sort of doing this in the service of offering a sort of semantics for the logical operators, for the logical constants. And, you know, we might think that what these logical operators do, like and, or, not, if, then, what these logical operators do or are is relations. Yeah, that we have relations between judgments. And so we might think that there must be something corresponding to these logical operators in the world. Just as we think that names for relations refer to relations in the world, what about these logical operators? What about these logical constants, these logical words? Do they function like names? So Wittgenstein, I think, introduces this idea that bits of language function like names. Names of individuals are names. Predicates are names. Relations are names. What about the logical constants, and, or, not? And it's going to turn out that he wants to offer an account of the meaning of the logical terms according to which that these terms don't function like names. Yeah, there is no and in the world. Yeah, and so he's going to offer an account of the meaning of the logical operators in terms of truth tables. Yep. So, and this is something I guess you're all familiar from baby logic classes, but this basically has its kind of origin in the Tractatus. He sort of introduced the idea of the truth table and then showed how we could define all of the operators and also the quantifiers in terms of truth tables. Yeah, and this is a way of explaining the meaning of these terms without suggesting that there has to be anything in the world corresponding to them. Yeah, so there's going to be nothing in the world corresponding with negation. Yeah, now, as a good Kantian, you know, have you ever been a member of the kind of Kant party? And I'm like, okay, yes, I have been, I'm sorry. As a good Kantian, I take it this is where, you know, Kant is going to break ranks with Wittgenstein, or Wittgenstein's breaking ranks with Kant. Because Kant thinks that, I mean, the big revolution in Kant's thought was he had this paper he wrote in the sort of like a pamphlet he wrote in, when was it, the 1760s, called this was about 18 years before the first edition of the Critique of Pure Reason, called The Introduction of Negative Magnitudes into Philosophy. And here he thinks, and by philosophy here, he means science. And so Kant thinks that there can be real opposition in the world. You have forces in the world that sort of cancel each other out, that negate one another. And so negation is something that's sort of found in the world. And it's the fact that these sort of logical things are found in the world, which I take it is the kind of source of Kant's idea that of the synthetic a priori. Yeah, that there are, according to Leibniz, that the fact that you can combine two things in thought means that they can really be combined. Yeah, so Leibniz thought that thinkability was a criterion of real possibility. Yeah, he sort of pointed out that in Descartes' ontological argument, one of the kind of presuppositions of the ontological argument is that God is possible. So we've got this concept of God as the most perfect being, the being that contains all perfections. And Leibniz was like, hold on a minute, how do we know that God is possible? How do we know that there can be such a being that combines all perfections? And Leibniz sort of had this argument that kind of realities cannot oppose one another. Yeah. Kant basically rejects this. So he thinks that the fact that you can combine things linguistically doesn't entail that they can be combined in reality. There are some things that are going to exclude one another in reality, even though they don't exclude one another conceptually. Any sort of ideas about things that exclude one another in reality, but not conceptually? So this is I'm trying to give you a sort of an account of the synthetic a priori, vaguely framed in sort of Wittgensteinian terms, to understand how in the Tractatus he's denying the possibility of synthetic a priori, and then in the late 20s, early 1930s, he came to see that he'd really messed up and was totally wrong. And of course, realities can exclude one another in reality. So the example that Wittgenstein realized destroyed the Tractatus was color. Yeah, so, the concept of being red and the concept of being green are two predicates, and any predicate can be combined with any object. Yeah, and so, there's nothing grammatically that stops you combining both red and green with a particular point. This point is red and this point is green. Now, grammar doesn't exclude you, logic doesn't exclude you combining these things. But in reality, one point cannot simultaneously be both red and green. Yeah, being red sort of excludes being green. And this exclusion is not a kind of logical exclusion, it's a real exclusion. Yeah. And so this is going to turn out what Wittgenstein sort of denies in the Tractatus, that exclusion is something that is a matter of logic, is a matter of it's analytic, and it doesn't correspond to anything real in the world. Yeah. So at the time of the Tractatus, that Wittgenstein thought that all truths, he had this division into two types of truths: factual truths, which are kind of contingently true, and necessary truths, which are all analytic. And in some sense, these analytic truths, all the necessary truths, don't tell you anything about the world. Yeah, that he thinks that it's raining tells you something about the world. Yep, and it tells you something that could be false. Yeah, because it's possible for things to be otherwise. Yeah, so any factual statement any statement about the world has to be factual. And Wittgenstein thinks that for any factual situation any factual claim could possibly be false. Yeah, that the negation of a factual claim is possible. So Wittgenstein's committed to the idea that the negation of any meaningful claim is possible. That logical truth, like it's either raining or not raining, its negation is necessarily false. That either it's raining or it's not raining is necessarily true. There's no way that the world could be that could make the claim that it's either raining or not raining false. Yeah, and so Wittgenstein, at the time of the Tractatus, wants to divide truth in a sort of Humean way, and of course influenced by Russell, who was very much coming from a Humean tradition. But like Wittgenstein, you can trace Wittgenstein through, in the kind of 1830s, you had the sort of millions who were radicals, empiricists, followers of Hume, opposed to the Reedians. Oh yeah, okay. Okay, so I'll tell you about 19th century British philosophy after the break, and how yeah, okay. So let's have a little break. How do I pause the recordings? Okay, so Okay, so let's have I think I've got a fairly good idea of what's going on in the Tractatus and how it sort of fits together. One thing I'm not completely sure about is Wittgenstein's understanding of thought and language. So there are times when he wants to identify the thinkable with what can be said. Yeah, but there clearly seem to be other times where he thinks that that we can in some sense thought overflows language. So in order to understand the limits of language, we have to be able to think that which goes beyond the limits. This is something he seems to suggest in the preface. Anyway, so I'm not sure. Yeah, I always have the slight feeling that he's slightly inconsistent in terms of his way of thinking about the relation between thoughts and language, and whether we think in language. Yeah, so is thought essentially linguistic, or are there things that are thinkable that are not sayable? And I'm not sure he's got a fully consistent picture. Yeah, so, and the reason for this is that he wants to kind of identify a thought with a logical picture. And a logical picture is something that has something, as I take it, something like linguistic form. Yeah, so all thought is something like judgment on this picture. Maybe he uses thoughts in like more than one sense as a sort of there's one sense where he wants to identify thought with what we might think of as judgment, with judgment being essentially understood in Kantian terms as sort of involving something like predication. And thought understood as judgment obviously does have some sort of logical form. Yeah, whereas sometimes I think he uses thought in a broader sense, where we have some sort of capacity to think things in a non-judgmental way. So is our values thinkable? Yeah, we can't is the mystical thinkable? Yeah. So anyway, so he says a logical picture of facts is a thought. And so we've had this discussion of the world. Then we have a discussion of picturing, or the idea of how models work. And now we get the claim that thought and language involve a sort of logical picture of the world. Yep. So that linguistic meaning, insofar as linguistic meaning is thought of in sort of descriptive terms, so we might have a certain type of meaning that goes beyond what can be described. We might think of poetic language, of moral language. But insofar as language is sort of depicts the world, take it that descriptive language works in the same way that other pictures do. So if we understand how picturing works, this will help us understand how language works. Yeah. And of course, the problem is we can't understand how picturing works because we can't have a proper understanding of a certain type of picture cannot depict its own form. And because all thoughts have a sort of logical form, then there's no way of thinking about, or at least depicting or describing logical form. Yeah. So he says, in a proposition, a thought finds an expression that can be perceived by the senses. So I think one thing that's important here is that it's not like we've got two things, the sort of mind and the world. Yeah, the sort of the normative and the natural, but we've got propositions, and linguistic or sentences are things that in one sense are best thought of as something like bits of the world. You've got a sentence that is a kind of a string of symbols on a piece of paper, and then you've got reality. And you use these symbols on paper, this string of symbols on paper, to somehow depict the way the world is. But both the string of symbols and the thing depicted are both bits of the world. Yeah. So this sort of way in which language represents reality, it's not like you've got two things. It's not like you've got the world of propositions in some Fregean third realm, and then you've got the physical world, but you've got one bit of the physical world representing another bit of the physical world. Yes, I think this is sort of important. So he says, in a proposition, and the word, I think proposition, this was translated by Ramsey in shortly after it was, the first publication. It was published in both English and German. Proposition, the German here, I believe, is Satz, which can be translated as sentence. Yeah, I think proposition in English, we think of a proposition, we make a distinction between a sentence and a proposition, and we think, well, the proposition is something like the meaning of the sentence, and the proposition is something abstract, whereas the sentence is something concrete. So I think here we're thinking of something like a sentence. And it is something that can be perceived by the senses. It's a string of symbols on paper, for example. Now, he says, I call the sign with which we express a thought a propositional sign. Yep. And a proposition is a propositional sign in its projective relation to the world. So, I mean, this is a bit hardcore. What do you think this means? I've got a story, but once again, we're getting into bits of Wittgenstein where it's not always obvious. So what's a propositional sign? A proposition is a propositional sign in its projective relation to the world. Anyone who did you do logic from? So I sat in lots and lots of classes with Ali Karatai. So my way of thinking about logic has been very influenced by Ali, and he's very good. And I think one thing is when you think about logic, I don't know how you learned logic, but I guess if you learned from someone who learned from Ali, maybe you learn it in the same way. But like, first of all, you have kind of, and I think the way he teaches it is a way that is quite congenial to understanding Wittgenstein. So you have kind of basically a bunch of symbols, and the symbols are introduced with no meaning. So you've got these symbols that don't have any meaning. You have small letters, big letters, and the like. And then you're given the rules about how you're allowed to combine these symbols. So you're given a set of rules that you can kind of iterate, and that gives you a sort of account of all of the strings of symbols that count as grammatical within this language. Yeah, so you're given a bunch of rules, you're given a bunch of signs, so you know what the basic signs are, and then you're kind of told what the rules are for combining these signs to produce grammatical strings. Yeah, so you can write FA. You've got big letters and little letters. You can write FA, but you can't write FF. You can't write AF. Once you've been given a one-place predicate, all you can do is write one letter or one variable after it. You've got two-place predicates, R, subscript 2. Yeah, with a sign like that, you have to go RAB, RAA, RAC. Yeah, so you've got the rules about which symbols can be stuck together to give you a meaningful sentence. Now, that gives you the sort of syntax of the language. And then you get the rules of proof. That's all on the side of syntax. But in order to have a sort of semantics, you need some assignment function. So, if you're learning logic, an assignment function, the semantics today, when we think of logic, is done in terms of set theory. And we think the assignment function basically assigns elements of the language to elements in the set. Yep. So each small letter, each name, it picks out a particular individual in the world, a particular element of the set. Each one-place predicate picks out a set of objects. Yeah. So the word F is a predicate, and what does F name? Well, it names all of the whole set, every object in your domain that has the property of being read. So you've got the predicate read, and this sort of way of thinking about logic is extensional. It explains the meaning of predicates in terms of what they refer to. And so what the predicate read refers to is the set of all read things. And so when you say A is read, that's going to be true if the object picked out by A is a member of the set of read things. So you explain truth in terms of semantics, in terms of in terms of set membership. Yeah, relations are going to be names of sets of ordered pairs. This is basically the kind of story of relation. So loves, yeah, names all of the pairs of individuals that stand in the relation to one another of loving. Yeah, and so this is how kind of we think about. So I take it, my way of thinking about what he means by a proposition then is that we've got the propositional sign. And the propositional sign is what you have when you've got once you've learned the language and the rules of combining. Yeah, so if all you've got is syntax, you've got propositional signs. And propositional signs are going to be something like syntactically well-formed strings of symbols. Yep, but that a proposition is something more than a syntactically well-formed string of symbols. It's a meaningful string of symbols. And what makes a string of symbols meaningful on this account is that each symbol has a sort of an assignment function. Each of the symbols refers to elements of the set. Yeah, so I take it that a propositional sign, as I'm understanding what's going on here, a propositional sign is just a well-formed string, a grammatically well-formed string of symbols. As long as this, yeah, but a proposition is a well-formed, a grammatically well-formed string of symbols together with something like an assignment function, where each assignment is assigned to elements in the world. Yeah, and so this is what I think he means by a proposition is a propositional sign in its projective relation to the world. So this idea of a projective relation to the world, I take what today we would call a sort of an assignment function when we're thinking about the relation between, when we kind of introduce a semantics for a formal language. The semantics involves assigning elements in the language, which are meaningless symbols, to elements in the world, where the world is normally kind of understood in terms of set theory. Yeah, so the domain is going to be like something like sets, a single set or sets of possible worlds, which are sort of sets of sets with relations, accessibility relations between them, and the like. So he says, in a proposition, a thought can be expressed in such a way the elements of the propositional sign correspond to the objects of thought. So once again, we have, now here it looks like it's thought that involves sort of reference. And yeah, so I take it that there's a bit of a sort of maybe a bit of psychologism left lingering here in his logic, that language only relates to reality insofar as there's some sort of thinker that's able to think about objects in the world. And so the assignment of elements of the language to elements in the world presupposes something like a thinker. And I you know, that later on when he talks about this sort of methodological solipsism, I take it that my understanding of Wittgenstein at this stage is that his logic is not this sort of, he hasn't, you know, a lot of people when they think about the origin of logic see this big kind of attack on psychologism. So like Frege's big thing and the development of modern logic is often characterized as a sort of rejection of this kind of Kantian picture that sees logic in terms of something like the laws of thought. Yeah, the laws that govern, and to kind of separate logic from psychology. But I think Wittgenstein doesn't really go that way, or at least that he thinks that an account of the way in which language relates to the world seems to presuppose something like a thinker. Because the assignment function of the signs to reality involves the things referred to being objects of thought. Okay, so he says, I call such elements simple signs and such a proposition completely analyzed. So a proposition is going to consist of simple signs, and a completely analyzed proposition is a proposition that only contains simple signs. Yeah. Now, yeah, and I take it these simple signs are going to be, and a fully analyzed proposition is one, I take it, that doesn't contain any variables. And then each of the symbols is thought of as a name. And that, you know, we've got three types of symbols, and these symbols can name individuals, properties, and relations. I take it today the standard view is that they name individuals and they name individuals and then sets of individuals and ordered n-tuples of individuals. Yeah, that's what relations are. But I think the standard view is to think of all of the simple signs. These are going to be the signs in your language that are not logical operators and are not variables, are going to be thought of as names. So he says the simple signs employed in propositions are called names. Yeah, so we have names of individuals, names of, so A, B, C are going to be names of individuals. F, G, H are going to, F and G are going to be names of properties, and R, whatever, they're going to be names of relations. Yeah, and these are all functions and names. So a name means an object. The object is its meaning. A is the same side as A. So the bits of the language all function as names, but they name objects that and then, you know, one of the things that Russell was worried about is the unity of the proposition. How can you put two names together to create a unified thought? If I just say Lucas Bashak, that's not a thought. That's just a string of Lucas Bashak, Hakan Ercan. That's not a thought. That's just a string of names. And there's going to be a difference between a string of names and a thought and a proposition. And I take it the sort of trick Wittgenstein wants to offer in the Tractatus is if the names pick out incomplete objects, if you have a bunch of signs that pick out the right incomplete objects, that the objects themselves are in some sense the source of the unity of the proposition. If Ergen names an individual and is happy names a property, then the putting together forms a complete thought. If Ergen is the sort of thing that needs to be combined with a property in order to become a state of affairs, and if is happy is the sort of thing that needs to be combined with an object to become a state of affairs. That's basically the idea. Yeah, so he says the configuration of objects in a situation corresponds to the configuration of simple signs in the propositional sign. So the propositional sign is this sort of string of symbols that there are going to be rules that kind of govern the way in which syntactical rules that govern the way uninterpreted symbols can be combined in the proposition. These are going to be rules that in some sense have nothing to do with the semantics. They're rules that kind of can be understood independently of the meaning. But I think the sort of claim is that in a meaningful language, at the very least, the way in which objects are related in the world somehow corresponds to the way in which the syntactic relations between the simple signs in the string of symbols. So propositional sign here, I take it that a propositional sign is just going to be a string of symbols. So he says, at first sight, a proposition, one set out on the printed page, for example, does not seem to be a picture of the reality with which it is concerned. But neither do written notes seem at first sight to be a picture of a piece of music, nor our phonetic notation, the alphabet, to be a picture of speech. Yet these sign languages prove to be pictures, even in the ordinary sense of what they represent. Yeah, so we have a bunch of marks on paper, a musical score, and this corresponds, the linear, the way in which the marks on paper are laid out in space, for example, correspond to the way in which a series of tones are laid out in time. So in a musical score, you're using spatial form to represent time. You're using things laid out in space and some symbols to represent pitch, which pitches occur at which times. Yeah, so a musical score is a spatial depiction of a temporal flow of sounds, for example. Now, so we can see how a spatial picture can depict something in space. We can see how a two-dimensional picture can depict. We can see how a two-dimensional picture can depict three-dimensional space. We can see how something two-dimensional can sort of depict something temporal. So we use a score to depict a stream of notes. Yeah, we often think of a score as a sort of of orders about how to produce something, but we can also think of a score as a sort of depiction of something that has occurred. So you've got the symphony, and then the score is going to be a depiction of what you just heard. Now, how does language work in this way? So, how can language work in this way? And let's forget about English because English is too messy. Let's forget about German because it's too German. Let's think of an ideal language. So this is what Wittgenstein's thinking of. We've got strings of symbols, the sort of language you learned in your baby logic classes. Yeah. Let's forget about quantifiers for the moment. Let's just kind of think of a language without quantifiers, where you've just got names. In what way does a sort of string of symbols in this, is a string of symbols in this language able to depict complex states of affairs in the world? And Wittgenstein thinks it's able to do this because of some shared logical form. So I'm going to talk about this next class, but I'll say a bit more about this if you want me to now. But any questions about any thoughts or questions about where we're at now? It's all quite dense. One thing is I think with this stuff, sometimes we can't do too much in one go, and you just need sometimes time to sit and think about it and read it a bit more. Or maybe you just find it really obvious and it's like easy. In which case you probably hadn't understood it because it's supposed to be nonsense. So Wittgenstein thinks that if you think you understand it, something's gone horribly wrong. Yeah, you can't win with Wittgenstein. Any sort of thoughts? Okay, so what about logical form? So you've got a few minutes left. I'll just say one or two things and then I'll stop, because I've sort of got through the material I wanted to get through today, and that was the sort of end point. And I think starting something else is a bit too much. But I think thinking about logical form, what is logical form, and how does logical form or sentential form or grammatical form correspond to, how can it correspond to reality? So let's think of a sentence in kind of Wittgenstein's ideal language. So let's suppose you've got the sentence, Lucas loves Zubaydah. Yep. So this is a two-place relation. It requires, it needs to be, when you've got a two-place relation, you need basically three symbols. And each of these symbols are going to be names. So you've got the symbol A, which refers to Lucas, the symbol R, which refers to loves, the relation of loving, and you've got the symbol B that refers to Zubaydah. So in this language, if we've got this assignment function that assigns A to Lucas, R to loves, the relation of loving, and B to Zubaydah, what is the logical form? Well, I mean, I think it's going to turn out that the logical form is, in some sense, spatial form. That in order to kind of say Lucas loves Zubaydah rather than Zubaydah loves Lucas, I write down the sign A is to the left of the sign R, which is to the left of the sign B. So the fact that these symbols stand in a certain spatial relation to one another, yeah, that the sign R is between A and B, with A to the left of R and B to the right of R, corresponds to the state of affairs of Lucas loving Zubaydah. Whereas I can take the same signs and I can write BRA, and I'm saying something different here because these signs have a different logical form. What's their different? Well, they're combined in a different way. And they're combined in a different way spatially. So the sort of thought is that the spatial relationship between signs in the language can somehow correspond to the relationship between objects in the world. Yeah. Now, of course, that we're using the spatial relations of the signs in the language to depict something that isn't about the spatial relations of the objects. It's not like the fact that A is to the left of R, which is to the left of B, means that Lucas loves Zubeide, is that it's telling us something about the relation between the objects depicted, but it's not telling us we're using these spatial relations between the signs to depict something about the relations between the objects. Yeah, and that's basically the idea. Now, I'm not. Yeah, so one thing about the Tractatus is that he's talking about language, but the language I think he's talking about is this ideal language of logic that sort of Russell has just invented. Yeah, so it's an ideally regimented language. In this ideal language, every simple sign is a name. Yep, so and the language just consists of simple signs. Now, of course, yeah, and every simple sign just refers to either to an object. Now, of course, yeah, so of course, we talk and speak in English or German or Turkish. I take it that according to this picture, the central thing about language is going to be something like predication. If we take like relations as just n-place predicates, then it's going to turn out that really the central thing about language is predication. That the form we're interested in is the form of predication. And then I take it the thought is that all language basically involves predication. That, I mean, I've written a bit about Turkish and about how the distinction between a noun phrase and a sentence is something that is sort of language specific. So many things that in English we're going to express as a sentence are just perfectly well expressible in Turkish as a noun phrase. And so this distinction between propositional signs, between propositions and the elements and names, I think sort of in Turkish sort of breaks down. And I think that having a view that starts off with names of complexes and having complex names, I think for me, this is a much more plausible way to think about how language develops. So Wittgenstein thinks of that, well, we have these atoms in the world, and then we need names for atoms, and then all meaning is built up by combining names of atoms. Yeah, I take it that, and this is why I think his project is tied towards towards Russell's sort of logical atomism. I take it though that we can go another way, which I take is more like the way William James goes, is that we start off with complexes, and we start off with a kind of grasp of complexes, and then we kind of learn to decompose these complexes. And so I take, in some sense, linguistic structure not to be a matter of sort of composition, but a matter of composition of sort of names of atoms. But I take it more of a sort of decomposition of the complex. So we could use these logical language in which to kind of develop a precise language in which we can talk about mathematical objects. Now, I think Wittgenstein thinks we are going to do this, and it's part of the project of logicism to try and reduce all mathematical truths to logical truths. So Wittgenstein does think this language is one that can be used as the language of mathematics. But at this stage, he's committed to the idea that all mathematical truths turn out to be necessary, and then all necessary truths are analytic. So he's committed to the idea that, to this sort of logicist project, that the truth of mathematics are in some sense don't have any content. They don't describe anything. Yeah, they're just logical. I think this is a view of sort of mathematical truth that was very popular until Gödel's incompleteness theorem, that basically blew up logicism as a program, because we've got the idea that there are some truths that can't be proved. And I take it that according to this view, we want to tie mathematical truth to something like logical provability. Anyway, I'm sort of done for today. Let's meet again tomorrow, our last Wittgenstein class before the election, Darren, I started grading. I had a whole bunch of so I mean, with Wittgenstein, I mean, just read as much as you can. So one option for what to read is, I've been trying to give you a sort of overview of the first three numbered sections of the Tractatus. And I've given you this handout where I've tried to give you a sort of map of what I take to be the kind of a pathway through these first three numbered sections. If you haven't read the first three numbered sections carefully, I would say just kind of read them with what we've gone through in class in your mind and see how much of it makes sense to you. Yeah. And I would say, like, after this class, if you come away from this class and all you kind of get from Wittgenstein is a sort of understanding of the first three numbered propositions, you've really learned a lot from this class. Yeah. So I would say, if you haven't done it already, I would just focus on the first three. If you kind of work your way through the first three and you've got that under your belt and you think it sort of makes sense, then you can start reading on a bit further. So I'm just going to start where we've sort of left off at the beginning of 4, and I'm going to look at a few passages from there onwards. But I would say, in terms of what you do, I don't know, if you're already confident with everything up till 3, just read on a bit further. But I would say, if you haven't got that under your belt, I would just say I would spend your time carefully reading the beginning of the Tractatus. And if all you get from this semester is the first 3, that's going to be fine for this semester. If you've got a bit more energy and a bit more time, pushing on a bit further is also something you can do. So I'm going to kind of be looking at a few passages. I'm going to start off at the beginning of the 4s, and I'm going to move forward. One thing for next class, if you want to, if you're reading through up to 3, at the beginning of class, if there are any particular sections that I haven't gone through on this handout that you would like to kind of, you read and you don't understand, we could talk about them in class. It's possible that I might be, I don't understand it either. But I think for most of the sections up until 4, I think I've got I think I've got a reading of sort of most of them. Yeah, so I think I've got something to, maybe there'll be some bits I'm just like, yeah, I'm not sure I can help you. I think on the whole, I think up until 4, I've got a fairly good idea. After 4, I've got some idea, but it gets a bit more complicated. Yeah, so I'll see you tomorrow. Any questions? Bye-bye.